Welcome back online to Dublin and the Grand Hotel in Malahide for our second day of our deliberations for the Dublin Citizens' Assembly. I'd like to welcome the Assembly members back into the hall. This morning we had a great chat, some of us, a great chat at breakfast, lots of debate going on about our deliberations yesterday. Socially, we met last night, and great to build the friendships and to see your passion for Dublin City and County, and again to reflect on the work that we're doing. So it was a really, we worked well into the night last night on debating various topics, and thanks for your candidness and your feedback to myself, Art, and the EAG. It was really productive. Before we start into today's session, I just want to go back over the terms of reference. It's always good to remind us what they are. And our role, again, is to consider the type of directly elected mayor and the local government structures that are best suited for Dublin, and bring forward proposals in that regard, and including making a report and recommendations to the House of the Oireachtas. So, just to bring some clarity, so in case there's some doubt about what we've been asked to do, we're not being asked to ask, should we have a directly elected Lord Mayor? A directly elected Mayor? That decision has already been made by the House of the Oireachtas. We've been asked what type of directly elected Mayor is best suited for Dublin. So that kind of came up last night. There was a little bit of confusion this morning again on that. So to reiterate, we're not being asked, is it a good or bad idea, or should we have one? We've just been asked what type of directly elected Mayor is best suited for Dublin. And then the discussions yesterday afternoon, and again what happened this morning, will be on the local government structures that are best suited to Dublin, which will obviously support that directly elected Mayor. Recapping on our plan of action, again, people that liked that slide yesterday, so and asked for to just remind ourselves what our journey is to the apex of the Dublin Mountain. So the first one is our session, which our EAG we have on the top table. From your right to left, we've Dr. Aodh Quinlivan, Dr. Brid Quinn, and Professor Deiric O'Brien, who will give you feedback on session one. And the reason we have it the sequence that way, we would have ideally started with it yesterday morning, but with the time constraints of our Lord Mayors, our Cathaoirleach and the Mayor, they had to they did other engagements yesterday afternoon, so we had to just fit them in with the programme. So we're just reflecting on, and it will actually build upon the discussions that we're having. So that's session one. We recap it now. We're in the middle of how do we do it, what others do, that's what we saw yesterday, and then possible options. And we're going to start into that session this morning about possible options for a directly elected mayor and what those local government structures might look like. And then when we meet again in a few weeks' time, we get deeper into what it should or could look like, and models and powers and structures around that. That's up for you to decide. When we convene again in September, the date to be confirmed, we'll narrow down and debate those options, and then agree our ballot papers for our fifth session, which will be in October, where we begin to vote, we begin to agree and we agree and make those recommendations on the type of directly elected mayor and the associated local government structures which are best suited to Dublin City and County. We compiled a draft report after session 5. We distribute it to the Assembly members, and you come back to the Secretariat, myself, with feedback. We finalise the report, and then our ambition is to have it published by end November of this year, issue that report and recommendations to our House of Oireachtas for them to action. I think that was very clear last night, is that we want action from this report. Okay, so if there's no media questions, then I'm going to hand over to the EAG for their feedback. Thank you.
Okay, I might as well kick off. So thank you for your interest and the questions that you submitted on foot of the first weekend. There were a lot of questions, so I will try broadly to address a few topics to do with councillors, chief executives, central local relations, the concept of the directly elected mayor, There's a lot there, but I'll do my best to cover what I can over the next few minutes, knowing I think that some answers were probably provided yesterday anyway. So as we know, we have 949 councillors across 31 local councils, and they operate within a local government system which can be described as a corporate model. In other words, the voters are akin to the shareholders. They elect the councillors, who ultimately are the board of directors, who in turn appoint a city manager, chief executive. And in fact, since 2014, councillors have an enhanced role in this regard. They can refuse to appoint the chief executive who is recommended through the public appointments process. Serving as a councillor is one of the few jobs in local government that does not have a job description. Some people are elected with what we might call a generalised commitment to serve the community, with no maybe clear idea of what exactly that service will involve. But despite that lack of a clear job description, nearly 2,000 candidates offered themselves for election to city and county councils in June 2019, willing to forsake personal time, business opportunities, privacy, etc. And as has been mentioned quite a lot, and it came up in questions, being a councillor is a part-time job, but based on research by the Association of Irish Local Government, the typical councillor puts in at least 30 hours per week in terms of their council activities. So it is very demanding, as well as trying to be on top of policy. Councillors hold clinics, they engage in local constituency work. They have to be knowledgeable clearly in local government matters, but in truth, they're probably also social workers, psychologists. You know, there can be an enormous emotional toll to what they do, because they're available 24/7. When a constituent knocks on your door on Christmas morning or rings at 2 a.m., she or he is normally in trouble. You know, it's not good news that they're calling to you about. So the councillor is constantly firefighting and trying to find solutions. There were a lot of questions, or a few at least, about how representative our councillors are. And there are deficits in this regard. I'll quote you from Dr. Mark Callan of the Institute of Public Administration, who has profiled the 949 councillors. And he says the profile of the average councillor is male, older than his or her constituents, middle class, well educated, and comes from a self-employed professional or community development background. So from that, we can kind of say that women, younger people, industrial and PAYE workers, people from ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, tend to be underrepresented in our council chambers. Regarding gender specifically, which came up yesterday, 24% of our country's councillors are women. The Dublin authorities lead the way here. Dunleer Rathdown has a 50-50 membership, while women comprise 41% of Dublin's City Council. And there probably are many different views in the room on the merits of gender quotas, but it is worth noting that gender quota legislation is in place for national elections since 2012, but not for local elections. Up to last summer, councillors received a representational payment of just over €17,000 per annum. In the summer, there was an increase of €8,000, and this followed a review by Senior Counsel Sarah Moorhead. But she pointed out, quite correctly, I think, that councillors need supports that extend beyond money. Administrative support, induction, ongoing training, etc. Turning to your questions on chief executives, formerly called city or county managers, they are an interesting and quite exclusive bunch of 31. They have their own representative organisation, the City and County Managers Association, which is influential. I always stress that the chief executives and the staff work for the councillors, but the reality is more nuanced. So in 1996, the government produced a policy document called Better Local Government, in which it stated with no ambiguity, the system as a whole can lean more in favour of the permanent officials. The pay grade, which came up in questions, depends on the size of the local authority, but you were looking at chief executive salary range of €150,000 to €200,000. By way of a profile and drawing on a book that came out last year by Richard Boyle and Fergal O'Leary, from the chief executives serving at that point, 68% were men, 32% were women. Most chief executives are appointed between the ages of 45 to 54. Increasingly, they are well educated, with 63% having a master's qualification and 4% a PhD. Half of them started their careers in local government as clerical officers and worked their way up. The other half started either in the private sector or a different part of the public sector. It is unusual for someone's first job in local government to be at chief executive level, but that is the case for Anne Doherty, the current chief in Cork City Council. Chief executives also tend to be quite mobile. The majority serve in between 4 to 7 different local authorities before landing the top job somewhere. One interesting aspect of local government is a level of accountability and public scrutiny that is greater than in the rest of the public sector or indeed in the private sector. What I'm getting at here is that, of course, some decisions are made behind closed doors at committees, but once or twice a month there is a public meeting of the council, open to the public, open to the media, where the chief executive can be challenged to justify their actions by the board of directors, i.e. the councillors. So this is where you might get some homework. So let's be honest, we're never going to be as funky or as cool as the Biodiversity Citizens Assembly with their field trips. But I would challenge you between now and September to attend a local authority meeting. You are entitled to be there, and most councils now live stream their meetings as well. So nothing beats attending a meeting, seeing the interactions between the mayor chairing the meeting, the councillors and the chief executive. For my sins, I spent a full 12 months tracking Cork City Council, attending every full council meeting, strategic policy committee meeting, functional meeting, for a book entitled Inside City Hall Politics. Remarkably, that year didn't lead to divorce, but my more substantive point is that it is hugely educational to see the system in action. So I'm nearly at the end, but a lot of questions were submitted about the DEM process and her or his role. I don't think I'm displaying any bias by suggesting that a directly elected mayor for Dublin will have limited value unless that person has the power and the resources to implement decisions. You might have seen that a week after our first meeting, the people of Bristol decided to abolish the directly elected mayoral model that had been in place for a decade. And there were a multitude of reasons behind this, but one was that people were disappointed by how little power Martin Rees actually had as the mayor. And understandably, we are interested in what would be a new dynamic between a directly elected mayor and a somewhat weakened chief executive. But I think the relationship between the DEM and the rest of the councillors is just as important. Can the DEM override the council? Can the council override the DEM? And this is, in essence, the difference between a strong mayor and a weak mayor that we could talk a little bit more about. Ultimately, everything comes back to the devolution of powers and finance from central government, and we need to think about this at 2 levels. What is devolved to the local authority as a whole, and whatever new structure that may emerge in Dublin? Within that, what is specifically devolved to the directly elected mayor? For example, is central government and the Minister for Transport likely to devolve all responsibility for transport in Dublin to a directly elected mayor? Every system that we heard about yesterday and that we'll hear about from Sean this morning can work. They all have merit, but they can only work if they're backed by the government. So it is not complicated. If local government is to be given enhanced powers and responsibilities, central government has to be prepared to loosen its vice-like grip and let go. So I'll spare you a rendition from Frozen on a Sunday morning, but they have to let it go. Thank you.
Okay, think you have me next. I thought we had some background slides. Do we, Cathal? Just to sort of show the grouping of the questions. So when we divided up the questions collected at the first weekend session, it was agreed I would look at the issues that sort of specifically related to Dublin. And luckily many of those were addressed over the weekend and yesterday, so I thought I'd won the Assembly question lottery. Unfortunately, the remaining questions raise very significant issues, so I hope you'll bear with me as I navigate some very complex issues arising from what we thought were seemingly quite straightforward questions, and then address some of the higher level thematic issues that a Brid and I will sort of address collectively. So I suppose one of the first questions, how many councillors are there in each of the 4 councils? So simple factual questions. So Dublin City, 63, Dún Laoghaire, Fingal and South Dublin, 40 each. Now, that's a very straightforward answer to what looks like a very straightforward question, but it's actually worth noting that historically the citizen-councillor ratio in Dublin has been quite skewed, and citizens were very underrepresented in comparison to other local authorities. Efforts were made to address this in 2014, and you'll probably hear over the course of the Assembly, we talk about 2014 as a sort of a signature year where the Local Government Reform Act kicked in. So what we saw in 2014 was the 4 existing Dublin councils saw their councillor numbers increase dramatically. However, the citizen-councillor ratio in Dublin remains quite skewed. So, for example, Cork County Council, which has a population of 332,000, has 55 councillors, while Fingal, which has a population of 296,000, about 10% less, has 40 councillors. And Dublin City Council, with a population of approximately 600,000, has 63 councillors. So it's not purely an academic exercise in analysing citizen-councillor ratios. And I suppose the majority of the seats in the Seanad, 43 of the 60, are elected by councillors. So you actually, historically, you had a hugely underrepresented Dublin in the second house of the Oireachtas. And while the 2014 changes saw some improved representation for Dublin, it remains underrepresented. There's also another sort of quirk within our constitutional system where local authorities have the right to nominate the president. If you decide that, to recommend some sort of new authority for Dublin, would that have the right to nominate the president? And if not, why not? I suppose the second related question, and again, I'm wearing my best diplomatic shoes, has the splitting up of Dublin into 4 administrative areas or counties been a success, and how has this impacted the townships? Okay, bear with me. So the establishment of the 4 local authority model in Dublin, I would argue, was a logical conclusion from the analysis carried out at the time over the 70s and the 80s. We'd seen really significant change with the establishment of the new towns coming out of the Miles Wright report in the 60s. So you saw the birth of Clondalkin, the expansion of Tala, the sort of massive expansion of Blanchardstown. But there's a strong argument we wouldn't do it that way now. So we'd actually probably be in breach of our commitments under the Council of Europe's Charter for Local Self-Government about the creation of new new counties, that they normally require some form of citizen vote. You might recall that Dermot mentioned the Charter yesterday. And again, the Irish state has signed up, and there are certain obligations that come with signing up. There has been some very colourful consequences of the establishment of the 4 local authority model. Some were stifled at inception, some not. We saw calls for new postal districts, and that's real. There was an argument for new county GAA teams. I think Jim won the argument and they decided not to do it. We had nuclear-free designations for some counties and road signs saying welcome to nuclear-free X. And there was an argument for new licence plates. That was never realised. And, there was argument for county sports teams. So, a county soccer team and things like that. I suppose the key result, that just to bear in mind, is that we have the creation of the 4 of the largest local authorities in the state and the subsequent distance from the citizen. Okay, so if you're in a small rural county, you have a limited number of councillors, and you have a much smaller population base. We have a much larger population base, and again, a relatively limited number of councillors. So that distance between councillor and citizen. I think it's an important part of your deliberations as we go forward. So while some of the 2014 reforms address some of the challenges by adding to the number of councillors and increasing Dublin's clout in the Seanad, the local authorities remain large by international standards, and they're growing, and that's something I might come back to later, and there's no coherent lower tier of decision-making underpinning this. The next question related to the relationship between the four mayors, how it is structured and how does it communicate across the four counties, the Lord Mayors and the councillors. So I think that was pretty well addressed yesterday and by the CEOs in the first week. But I think the key issue to bear in mind is the level of reliance on personal contact and informality. There's no formal structure as such. So it really is built around goodwill and personal relationships. And that's something we may come back to later on. The fourth question, how would a DEM process ensure that the candidates have the skills and the experience required? This is the easiest answer. This is a democratic choice made by the citizens of Dublin. They decide the appropriate skills and experience. Okay? There's no formal criteria for nearly any election except being an adult. After that, the people decide. So you may see evolving and changing perceptions of what's the appropriate criteria. And I think that, again, that's for you to think about in the coming period. Fifth question, why have the efforts to instate a directly elected mayor failed so many times before? I think that was very well addressed yesterday. So, we may come back to it again, but I think it was very well addressed. And again, the final question, the other cities' local authorities been protected. How are they protected from central government? Again, I think that was quite well addressed yesterday, and Sean spoke to that, I think, quite powerfully. So in relation to the broader thematic queries about relationships, coordination and collaboration, so I think in relationships, I think it's the current system stresses the strong incentives for good personal relationships as the institutional structures, with limited exceptions, and we'll talk about this maybe later, the Eastern and Midland Regional Assembly and the National Transportation Authority. With those limited exceptions aside for transport and broad economic development, there are relatively limited formal structures. I think it's also important to note or highlight there's a wide number of parallel mechanisms and structures. So there's a regional skills forum. So, one of the speakers yesterday talked about they really want to invest in skills. In Dublin, that's a parallel process. We have a new climate action regional office, which is doing great work, but again, it's linked to, but not, it's distinct from the local authority system. We have the same with the city and county education and training boards, the Office of the Eastern and Midland Waste Region, tourism, some public health functions. And these are areas where the local authorities are involved, but are not driving the process. And again, as we've talked before, that's quite unusual. That's something in other countries you would see the local authority really driving the process. In terms of collaboration, I think it's important to note the lack of a coherent institutional structure outside spatial planning and transport planning, and the reliance on personal relationships. But there's numerous examples of collaborative success across the Dublin local authorities. The data sharing Dublinked initiative, the Smart Dublin initiative, the Dublin Enterprise Zone, just to name a few. I suppose in terms of coordination, I do want to start by highlighting and noting some very concrete examples, and I've mentioned the Climate Action Regional Office, and then there's something called the Metropolitan Area Strategic Plan, which is developed by the Eastern Midland Regional Assembly. I'll come back to that because it's quite significant, I think, for your deliberations and for the coming week's work. But I think it's really important to note the lack of a local government-centred and Dublin-focused framework for collaboration. There have been some very successful collaborative initiatives, including the Creative Dublin Alliance in the noughties, led by the then City Manager John Tierney, the current Dublin-Belfast Economic Corridor initiative that involves Dublin City and Fingal and the local authorities all the way up to Belfast. But I think one of the key issues, and just to build on A's point, it's the lack of budget for collaboration between the local authorities and the other significant agencies and private and civil society stakeholders. So it really is quite an ad hoc response to issues as they arise. Now, I mentioned something called the Dublin Metropolitan Area Strategic Plan, the MASP. I'm conscious that, Brid and I, we probably sounds like we live in a world of acronyms. And unfortunately, I think sometimes that's the case. But the Metropolitan Area Strategic Plan, I think it is important for for your deliberations to sort of get your teeth into. So it's prepared by the Eastern Midland Regional Assembly in collaboration with the local authorities and the transport and infrastructure providers, and it sets out a 12-year strategic planning and investment framework for the Dublin metropolitan area to 2031 and a long-term horizon to 2040. So it's a really significant view of what happens in Dublin for the next 20 years. One of the things it does, it envisages a population of 1.65 million people living here by 2031. So that's in 8 years' time, or 9 years' time. We're looking at an extra 250,000, if not more, living in the Dublin Local Authorities area. Now, this vision, it's underpinned by a spatial framework that supports a much broader regional, spatial and economic strategy that the councillors and the local authorities would have had some involvement in. And a focus on consolidating Dublin city and suburbs, but also focusing on the key towns of Swords, Maynooth, Bray, planned developments in Donabate, Dunboyne, Leixlip and Greystones. So you'll immediately note the implications for this plan for a directly elected mayor. And I think your deliberations and in the coming sessions, you'll have an opportunity to tease through the matters as they relate to the region outside of the historic Dublin County and how that might work and the powers that might need to be devolved and the relationships built to actually help that progress neatly. So as an assembly, you'll have gathered from the contributions the importance of sort of a coherent and substantial cross-Dublin tier led by a directly elected mayor. In parallel, you'll have to consider the importance of maybe a directly elected regional assembly to whom the DEM would be accountable or not. But it raises critical questions for the assembly. So if you accept the arguments for that regional tier, would it be a single cross Dublin constituency of maybe 20 or 30 or 25 or 35 full-time councillors, or 4 local authority-based constituencies suggested by some of the mayors? Or would all the existing councillors be members, or some variation of the above? So that's just one potential strand and all the issues that might arise from that potential strand. And if you accept sort of that argument for a cross-Dublin tier of government, you might need to consider the building blocks of that cross-Dublin tier. Is it, as suggested by many of the bears and the Chief Executive, best to retain the existing local authority model? Or is it time to look at a smaller building block closer to the citizen, or some variation of the above? And we've had previous efforts at reform, at creating a tier below through municipal districts in the 2014 legislation. And finally, what are the implications? And they are very significant to tease through. But if I can leave you with a request, I think the Assembly, it's fair to say, is bound to deliberate and recommend the most appropriate model of government for Dublin, not as what is perceived to be the most politically or financially or logistically feasible. What might be considered radical today is quite possibly tomorrow's obvious. The power is vested in you as a Citizen Assembly to consider this. So I'll thank you for your attention. I'll wish you well in your efforts today, and I'll hand over to Brid.
Thank you, Deiric. Good morning, everybody. What you love early on Sunday morning, I drew the finance questions. And right, Cathal, you might move on one slide, please, that I'll come to later. The first question and the next one, please. Sorry. There was a diagram that I want later. Why is there such little expenditure? Oh, sorry, I know what happened. You got an earlier version, not to worry. Right. Why is there such little spending at local level in Ireland? I think from listening to all the contributions yesterday and so on, and you were very taken by Diarmaid's ranking of Ireland. But I do want to add what I said in week 1. You're not comparing like with like. So if they include health and education and so on, they have things like teacher salaries, and so that skews the finance. So take a more nuanced view there. There were a lot of questions about the budget process, and that's what I thought was on the slide. And we'll send you on the slide afterwards, because the budgeting process is a long one. There are various steps. The first step is deciding on the rate of the LPT, the local property tax. We told you reminded you last week, it can vary by plus or minus 15%. So that's the first decision that has to be made by each council, and that's reserved, that decision, to be made by the councillors. The manager can't decide that, the full council has to decide that. Then, between September and November, like in any business, the directors of service will try to work out what they need for their budgets in conjunction with the chief executive, the corporate policy groups and strategic policy committees, CPG and SPCs, will again kind of be looking, everybody's looking for more money for their particular grouping and so on. So there's lots of discussions, debates and so on. I see the councillors nodding their heads. They've been there, done that and so on. And then, so gradually, with all those steps, you come to the draft budget, and then that will be brought before the council, and it has to be voted on by the councillors. And I think I might have mentioned the last time as well, there have been situations when there is a deadline set by central government for each local authority to have their budget in place, and there is a deadline. And they've been, the meeting has gone on until 11:58 or 59, just to make sure that they made that deadline. Because the ultimate sanction, if they can't agree on a budget, is that the minister can actually take and decide on that if the council themselves don't do it. But that ultimate sanction hasn't been used for a long time, by the grace of God, or negotiations at the end. Right. Is extra expenditure allowed and so on? So borrowing in local authorities is only permitted really for capital projects, and to borrow they have to have permission from the minister. So it's not easy to borrow. One innovation down in Limerick, they've actually a huge project going on, and they borrowed money from the IMF, and that's unusual. They were the first council. I think some other councils are doing that, but all of that had to have permission from the minister. Local authorities are not allowed to have their current accounts overdrawn or whatever. They have to keep that in balance. And there's also a fiscal rule nationally that the total amount of borrowing, there's a limit of 200 million euros on the total sector's fiscal deficit for any year. So it's all very well legislated for and policed, and you have the oversight of the local government auditors, and what, again, you were reminded yesterday of NOAC, the National Audit and Oversight Committee. The decision making, so as I say, you see step by step on the slide. I'm sorry that it got mixed up, and that's what I was trying to send on my phone to make sure that it was here. There's a question here, can the CEO decide where money that is allocated to the council goes geographically? So you have, in the discretionary funds, you've heard, you have grants that are ring-fenced and for specific purposes, and they can only be spent on those specific purposes. But then you have what they call own resources. So some of the money that's collected from the property tax, car parking, all those things, they've discretion in how they spend that. And what's done each year is they have what they call the GMA, the General Municipal Allocation. So each municipal area gets a certain allocation, and they can decide what to prioritise that on, whether they want parks, roads, whatever it is that they do. So it's not the CEO that makes that decision, it is the municipal group. Right. How much autonomy and control do councils have on how funds are spent? I think you could all answer that question and get first-class honours in your answer at this stage. And a reminder, the autonomy they have is over their own resources. The rest of the grants are usually very specific. There was a question about budget underspending and budget overspending. Well, the underspending rarely happens because there are always, if there's money left over, there are always lots and lots of ideas. And then you sometimes see at certain times of the year a rush to maybe do roads or whatever. If funding has been allocated from central government, and it usually has to be spent by a certain date, and if it's not spent by that date, it goes back to the Custom House. So no local authority that I know of wants to be sending back money to the Custom House. So there will always be a way found for spending that money. So as I say, there's never an underspend. And then the borrowing I've mentioned already, there are very strict controls over borrowing, and they must keep their accounts in balance. The distribution of the local government fund, how is that allocated across the country, was the question. Well, there's a baseline is set by central government. So this is the amount that no local authority, or that each local authority needs to keep in business. So that baseline is set. So there's the figures. So I'll just say, take as an example, 1.5 million. So some counties with their local property tax and some of the cities might collect a lot more than 1.5 million, and others mightn't get anywhere near the 1.5 million. So central government looks at the potential gaps between what is going to be earned from the obvious sources and what the councils need, and they allocate then the local government fund to fill that gap between the capacity that the local authority has to earn money and what they can actually get. And where does that money come from? Our local property tax, local authorities get to keep 80% of it, but each local authority has to give 20% of the LPT to central government, which is then redistributed among the other councils, plus not only the LPT, but also money from central government for local government. So there is a complex system for working it out, but that's kind of a short explanation of how it works. And the local government fund is made up of 25% of the local government fund comes from local property tax, 60%, because there was another question about the motor tax and what happens to that. So 60% of the motor tax goes into the local government fund and is redistributed, as I said. And the last 15% of it comes from payments from the Exchequer. Okay. Right. Then another LPT question was how much funding was lost to councils following the introduction of the local property tax. Well, in most cases, they actually gained, but we had our audit committee last week, and one of the interesting things that come out, as a citizen, you all know the local property tax bans changed recently. What is happening in a lot of councils is because the bans have been widened, their income from LPT is actually going down because more people fit into the lower bands. So it looked as if local LPT was going up for people, but in actual fact, the LPT is going down. So that's something that's going to cause long-term issues and so on. So there are some responses to the questions you asked about finance and so on. There's a very good website, local government finance. Again, now that the Citizens Assembly website is about to be launched, we'll put the address for that, and you can actually go into that, see your own county, your own district, what's spent in it, the other districts. You can look at, if you want to, some of the NOAC reports, the value for money. They compare spending in local authorities on different things and so on. So there's a huge amount of information available on that. So that covers the financial end of things. Then there were some questions about citizens. One was on education and information. And what many people don't realise is that there's actually programmes at the two levels in secondary schools, sort of civic education. In the junior cycle, they have a short course in CSPE, civics, social and personal education. And there's 3 main strands to that one: the rights and responsibilities of people, global citizenship, and exploring democracy. So if any of you have children in secondary school, they should be talking things like that. For Leaving Cert, there's actually a subject, politics and society. And that came on stream as part of the commemoration cycle. So in 2016, this was started kind of to mark the centenary of 1916. And it's an option in all schools since 2018. So again, that's there. In the primary schools, the Department of Education organises various projects and so on. And sometimes local authorities actually organise things with schools. And I think there's a great opportunity for more involvement here. And I think maybe I'd appeal to the councillors who are here to maybe liaise with the secondary schools and see what's happening in these projects. Can you provide ideas? Could they do something useful for the council and so on? I think there's a huge... And also, those of you who are not councillors, you're possibly in community organisations or even as individual citizens that you would say, right, I'm an expert on X, Y, or Z, and if you want me to talk to the students about that, all those sort of things are so important. Another resource that's great from the education point of view, the Oireachtas website has a lot of slides and presentations and short documents and so on democracy issues. So again, they're very good, very user-friendly and so on. So they're all out there. So there's that kind of education is out there. Hopefully, but I think I've been saying this, and I mean, when I was a primary teacher, we had civics, and they always got a grounding in government, and surprise, surprise. And I would be hoping to see the benefits of that coming over the years with a greater interest in politics from different people. Sorry, right. Another question was, why is the general public education about elections much lower about the local elections than in the case of general elections? And, when I was working, thinking about that and answering it was, is it lack of interest? ? Or is it because the local government system actually works kind of well, so people don't have to worry about it, and, the things happen, and the pathways, the roads, the transport works, is it that? But also I think for most people, they don't perceive local politics to be as important as national politics. How would you have felt before you got involved in the Citizens' Assembly? I suppose the fact that you volunteered to be in the Citizens' Assembly is indicative of the fact that you have an interest in local politics. But, think about your families and friends, how many of them are interested, whereas national politics, they'll keep abreast of those. What education is available to people to make them aware of what the council does? Well, the website is the first stop, and the websites are excellent. Look at various websites. Some are better than others, but they're all pretty clear and good. And the other place of keeping in touch is the local paper or some of the free newspapers. There's always great coverage of what's going on in the council and the council meetings and what happened there. And then there was a question about consultation and whether the credibility of the council is lost when their input and the public's consultation is ignored. But with regard to consultation, I think the local authorities are like John Stores, getting better all the time. Yeah. And I think that is true. And also, there used to be a culture in the organisations of being sort of open and welcoming inquiries and so on. Gradually that is changing, and every local authority is making an effort. So if you asked that question 10 years ago, it would be a more negative answer. I do think there's a lot of good things happening. You'd be glad to hear coming reasonably near the end. The last thing that I want to talk about, there was questions about what can an ordinary citizen do to help the local council deliver better services. And here's my suggestions to you. First of all, respond to consultations. Every single one of you is entitled to get involved in local area planning and all of this. There are calls time after time. You know, maybe get into the habit of once a month, I look at the local authority website and see what's going on. You know, something might irritate you, but something might excite you, and just go and see what's doing. Wearing my audit committee hat, my next thing was pay what you owe. So if you're a business person or whatever and you pay rates, please pay them as soon as you can, because the whole budget is kind of waiting for that. I say that with tongue in cheek in a way, but at the same time it is important. The one that I'd write in capital letters if I had a slide was get involved some way or another. You can get involved formally, either in some cases through the strategic policy committees. They're always looking for people with different skill sets and backgrounds, so get involved that way. In the LCDC, the Local Community Development Committee, you may be representing an organisation there, and the Public Participation Network. It's out there. Sign up to it, and then you'll be aware of all that is going, so get out there and get involved. Support the activities organised by your local authority, everything from their book festivals to competitions. I know when I get home this evening, my neighbour wants me to write a submission for the Residents Association for a prize or for money for gardening and things like that. So that'll be my homework tonight. But things like, you know, get involved in those competitions and so on. We've a lovely border in our estate that came from money that the council gave us to have to be aware of biodiversity, and so we've planted that here. So that's it, and raise awareness among your friends and your family. So, and the last thing that I wanted to say, and I deliberately wanted to be last for this, is, you know, the question is involvement and so on. Your contribution to the Citizens' Assembly is a vast contribution. So you can really give yourselves a pat on the back for that. And you have power. We talk about power and power. You here in this room have power to make history. Now, I know it seems like you're going to be designing a jigsaw, if you like, but it's a very important jigsaw. And the jigsaw analogy is a useful one because you can have all shapes and sizes in the pieces together. So again, I wanted to say thank you for getting involved, and go and design a wonderful jigsaw, please.